Hello, Cupertino. I am Kestrel Jenkins, the host and the producer of the Conscious Chatter podcast, an inclusive audio space dedicated to exploring why what we wear matters. I am so humbled to be able to share a little bit of time with you for your Earth Day celebration. So first of all, thanks so much for having me. So the focus of my show has expanded over the years alongside my own knowledge evolution, while the core intention remains the same, being an inclusive audio space that opens the door to conversations about our clothing and the layers of stories, meaning, and potential impact connected to what we wear. Conscious Chatter has now also become dedicated to reimagining the narrative around sustainability, exploring the importance of resourcefulness, questioning conscious consumerism, and working to deconstruct how oppressive systems impact the sustainable fashion space. So that's a lot. But before we dive into more layers around what I like to call the unsustainability of fashion today, I just want to acknowledge that as a white woman working at the intersections of fashion and sustainability, and at times being considered a leading voice in the space, it's so important for me to acknowledge and pay respect to the leaders in the space who have been very instrumental in my own learnings along the journey. So throughout my chat, I'm going to be sharing the names of educators who have played an important role in my personal education because I want to credit their work and how much they've impacted me. So I encourage you to learn more about them, follow them on social media, and support them and their work however you can. Okay, so let's take a step back to further understand what's actually going on with the fashion industry today. To be completely honest, the industry is an absolute mess. From the farming practices, to the materials being used, to the toxic dyes, to the ways people across the supply chain are being exploited, to the disconnected supply chains, to so many other layers. The overarching fashion industry is operating in extremely exploitative ways where profit and overproduction rule above all else. So how do we get here? A lot of times the discussion around the issues within fashion start with fast fashion, which came out of brands offering cheaper clothing options hitting the US market in the 90s. You know, there's labels like Zara and H&M and Forever 21, they're prime examples. So the arrival of fast fashion brought along with it two important influences on the clothing industry. The democratization of fashion, which basically made fashion-forward clothing more accessible when it comes to price point, which is so important when we talk about access. Also, fast fashion aligned the idea of disposability with our clothing, something that has largely impacted our relationship with our garments today. We've been trained through our culture to disconnect from our clothes and think of them as something we can just throw away. Like when they wear out, just buy new ones, right? When in the past, mending, taking care of your garments, and extending their lives was actually just part of our lifestyle. So for contextualizing some of the history around fast fashion, I want to make my first nod to educator and writer Elizabeth CLINE. Through her books, she's put together really important statistics and stories to help us understand the more modern history of fashion. Some stats that she shares in her book include clothing is one of the leading drivers of climate change, responsible for 8% of all carbon emissions, more than all international flights combined. Oof. Clothing is also one of the fastest growing categories of waste to landfills, with one garbage truck load of clothes dumped every 2 minutes in the US. Elizabeth has also been on a couple episodes of Conscious Chatter, so I want to recommend the most recent one, episode 181, where we talk about her newest book, The Conscious Closet, and ways that you can actually get active. So here's a little segment from that show.
To me, it's a doorway. You are stepping through a doorway into a wider cause, but the consumption piece of it is just one part of the whole story. Like, we also need activists. We also need people working on this in government. We need people running NGOs. We need educators. The consumption is it's not the whole picture. So I don't want people to feel like, if they bought something, I know that you hear this too. Someone will come up to you and be like, "Oh, sorry, this is from Zara." And
Mhm.
I'm like, please don't feel bad about that. That's not what we're about. Everyone is invited. I mean, that is a big part of the book, is like making sure everybody feels included, no matter what their budget is, or honestly their bandwidth for this is, because people have so much fighting for their attention right now. A lot of people are involved in other causes, and they're always just like, "Elizabeth, like, I care, but give me the easy thing. Like, tell me one thing I can do to get started." And I think that that's really important, is making sure people know one or two easy ways they can make a difference, even if they're not going to change their whole life today.
Okay, so now we're here. We understand that the fashion industry today is very linear and it's built on a system that perpetuates waste and overproduction while continuing to fuel overconsumption. But this isn't the whole story, like, not even close. We have just started to break down the reality that the fashion industry is complicated, complex, and I guess at times overwhelming because there's so many layers to it all. But thus far, I would say we haven't really gotten to the root issues at all. So, if we think about fast fashion, it's just another byproduct of some of the historical ways that the fashion industry was built. Fashion is operating with inequity at its core today. And that can be traced back to colonialism, the stealing of land, the enslavement of peoples, and capitalism. We absolutely do not have enough time to dive into all of the nuances surrounding the historical context in order to understand how fashion operates today. But I do want to recommend a resource for you. This past year, I collaborated with environmental educator DRAKEFORD to produce a 6-part series called The Root: Decolonizing the Sustainable Fashion Agenda. It features 17 educator activists who help us begin to contextualize all of the historical realities that have helped build the fashion industry and how that history is still playing out in the way the industry operates today. So I would like to give a massive nod to Dominique, who hosted and co-produced this 6-part series and has been instrumental in helping me further contextualize the work that I'm doing connected to fashion. If you want to begin understanding more of the root causes of fashion's issues today, this is definitely the place to start. Here's a couple snippets from the series to give you an idea of what it's all about.
I mean, we have these really interesting narratives that have been inserted into our worldviews from a colonial lens and from a colonial historical analysis that kind of frames pre contact Indigenous people as uncivilized, unstructured, and unadvanced in economies, when in actuality, there were thriving trade networks that spanned across the Americas from North America to South America prior to contact.
When we think about first contact as well, we have to include a sense of Afro indigeneity that isn't necessarily just rooted in slavery, but is rooted in cohabitation, trade contact, circular shipping routes, and wind trade routes that already exist, and that Europeans use already existing routes as a way
Mm.
to enrich their economies. The extraction of intellectual, emotional, physical labor, forced migration, exile African peoples and their descendants, First Nation peoples, indigenous throughout the Western Hemisphere, Asian, Southeast Asian communities within the context of the Western Hemisphere, and then also free land.
Ultimately, what it was just the driving of these corporations that held so much power that they then became governments and rebranded themselves as, democratic organizations that were carrying out the work of God. And that work of God looked like genocide. It looked like
Manifest
theft.
destiny.
Yeah, it looked like theft of bodies, it looked like theft of children, it looked like intentional biological warfare. And I just wanna
Hmm.
add, Dom, to the comment that you made that, with racism, there is always an underlying economic agenda for racism.
Yep.
And that's what this notion of a subjugated other is that desire ultimately for greed and power. And
Yeah,
therefore,
absolutely.
the other is less than, therefore the other can be exploited, therefore the other doesn't feel pain, and their suffering is insignificant.
Nikki and Lisa, y'all have woven together such a powerful conversation about the importance of history and how critical it is to reclaim not only the fullness of our own histories independently, but that of other beautifully adjacent indigenous cultures with which modern systems were built upon. There is literally no such thing as a sustainability conversation without an intentional understanding of the cultural and environmental cost of being melanated on this land. But more importantly, the root of sustainability is in Native American and global Afro-Indigenous sovereignty that existed before colonial frameworks. From the spectrum of cultural autonomy and reclaiming alternative systems to the pillars of genocide and the tools for marketing them, this has to be the new standard of conversation if we are truly discussing sustainable solutions.
So I also want to pull back a little to acknowledge and to frame up some of the origins of the overarching sustainability conversation. While the ideals connected to sustainability have been utilized within Black and Indigenous people of color societies and communities for years and years, the so-called sustainability industry does not have a history of acknowledging that deep wisdom, and it's been a disconnect. Sustainability started with a white-dominated narrative, one that was highly focused on technological developments and ways you can basically buy your way into the movement. It's been known to put off a somewhat exclusive club sort of vibe and has reinforced the idea that the primary way to be sustainable is to buy differently, that shopping can somehow save us. Again, it's been very aligned with the capitalistic nature of our society. The sustainable fashion industry in general has also been known to perpetuate a binary between the global north and the global south. It's been drenched in white saviorism, with women of color often only being represented as the garment worker who is helpless and in need of our saving, which is totally incorrect and messed up. So this is something that especially those of us who are white and working in the industry really must constantly be aware of, be questioning and unpacking so we can better communicate inside and outside of the industry. I want to make another nod to a past guest on Conscious Chatter now, Aditi Meyer, who massively impacted my understanding of these aspects of the industry. Here's a little audio from my past chat with Aditi.
I knew I wanted more than just pretty imagery. I wanted my work to have more potential for purpose. And I think that same sentiment was really shared with how I saw sustainable fashion. It was a lot more than saying, look at this pretty dress, right? But it looked more at the flows of labor and female empowerment and whatnot. So that was like the beginnings of my journey. But around the same time, so this was still my first year in college, I went to my first sustainable fashion event. And I remember being very jarred at what I saw. So I'll leave out the name of the brand, but I went to an event, and basically going into this event, there was like these blown up images of children of the developing world, basically leveraging off a very poverty porn perspective. The demographic of those attending was very, very homogenous, all white women that were pretty much from an affluent background, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, being the only woman of color there, I noticed this dynamic, and it spoke to a lot of realities of race, class, of privilege within the industry. And to be completely honest, it felt a little elitist, but I don't think I had the language at that time to vocalize what was going on. But I definitely realized that fashion at large is really a microcosm of larger systems of inequality, right? I didn't have the language at that point, but it literally was a pivotal time in like leading me to question, why is it that Black and brown bodies are always relegated to the role of the laborer, creating for a white consumer? Or what were the larger systems in place that kind of created these systems of inequality, both locally and abroad?
So I want to speed up a bit to where we are today. We are living amidst a global pandemic. COVID-19 has transformed so many aspects of how we're existing today, individually and through our work. And the fashion industry is yet another industry that has had its deep inequities further exposed through these really challenging times. Some of the ways that we've seen that play out across fashion are brands canceling their orders from their factories when the orders were already complete, leaving the factories in a really difficult situation, and especially leaving garment workers in a super vulnerable and challenging place. If you aren't familiar with it yet, I want to share a bit about the Pay Up campaign, which was launched to help try to get factories and workers to pay for the product and work that had already been completed. Because at the onset of COVID-19, brands just canceled orders even though they were already done. So the campaign has already helped get $22 billion from apparel companies paid back to factories and workers. But there still are billions of dollars that are owed. You can learn more about it and sign their petitions and get involved at payupfashion.com. On that note, I want to make a nod to AYESHA BARENBLAT, who is the founder of Remake, who was a massive part of building the Pay Up campaign. Here's a little audio from my past chat with AYESHA.
We're talking about such wicked issues and it's easy to get overwhelmed, but movement building is about each of us finding our power, right? And whether it's an everyday customer, sending a tweet or writing on Facebook or on Instagram and just asking a brand, I want to know more about the women that make our clothes, that matters. The next time you're at point of sale and you're thinking about, this is so cheap, there's no way that people are not exploited in this process, I'm going to go rental or vintage, I'm going to walk away, that matters. Having conversations with your community, at Remake, outside of our conscious fashion community, we've got 126 ambassadors now. And one of the things we've realized is, people don't like to be preached at. But our community of ambassadors, when they're hosting swap parties, when they're doing film screenings, they're essentially bringing their community along. And that's how we can have this bold, audacious goal of today it's 100 women. By the end of the year, by God, we can get to 100,000. Maybe in 5 years, we can get to 1 million. And this sort of grassroots activism is really what's going to disrupt the status quo. Because if each of us throw up our hands and say that our individual voice doesn't matter, then we'll get nowhere.
Another aspect of the sustainability discussion that has really transformed in the mainstream over the last year or so is the way that intersectionality is further integrated into the discussion. These ideas and frameworks have been utilized for years and years, and we have to acknowledge and credit Kimberly Crenshaw and her work with intersectionality. After the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Leah Thomas made a post on Instagram stating "Environmentalists for Black Lives Matter." And her post went pretty much instantaneously viral. This helped set the stage for her and her co-founders to launch Intersectional Environmentalists, which has become a really incredible resource hub for thinking and acting in ways to protect both people and the planet. They're all about helping us understand that the climate crisis is disproportionately impacting communities of color. I think it's undeniable that their work has flowed over into other industries, and the fashion space is yet again another one. They really have helped slowly wake the industry up to the ways it must be thinking more intersectionally to really build a better future. So, okay, let's get back to fashion more specifically here. I want to touch a little deeper on something that I mentioned. This idea that the sustainable fashion industry has so regularly taught us that we need to buy this and not that in order to be part of this movement. This is totally inaccurate and goes against how I think about sustainability. For me, it's about getting creative, using what we have, and only buying things when we really feel like we need them. Or, okay, maybe when we have been looking at something for days and days, it's been in the cart at the store online for a long time, and we know when we bring it into our wardrobe, we're gonna love it and take care of it and like really wholeheartedly have it be part of our closet. But I wanna make a nod to Reza Christian, the founder of Sustain the Mag, with regards to resourcefulness. She is someone who I feel like really helped crystallize this idea in my mind through our conversation. Here's a little audio from my past conversation with Reza.
As far as like an everyday lifestyle, I like to say to use everything to its last breath, reuse things. And this goes back again to my heritage growing up in a Mexican household. Don't feel like you have to buy something, reuse what you can, and just keep using things like until its last breath. So like, let's say something broke, a shoe broke, learn to mend it or maybe get it fixed, because if you can keep things for as long as you can, that's being sustainable and that's being resourceful.
So as I mentioned, it's not all about buying, but obviously at times we're going to want to buy something new or need something. And it can get confusing and overwhelming really fast if you're trying to sift through all the marketing out there today, attempting to reel you in through their sustainability messaging when they may or may not actually be doing the work behind the scenes to back up those claims. I was thinking, okay, yeah, I'll share some ideas about greenwashing with you. But then honestly, I think that puts too much pressure on you as everyday people. We can't do everything. So here's something really simple I think we can all integrate into what we do on the daily. Ask more questions, and yes, keep asking more questions. We have the right to demand more information from brands and retailers if we need more clarification to feel comfortable about what we're buying and where we're putting our dollars. Okay, I feel like I've been talking about fashion from this like super macro lens throughout this chat to give you more context on the industry and how we've gotten to where we are today. But when we think of the inequities across the fashion industry, this isn't something just happening in other countries where apparel manufacturing is more prominent. It's also happening right here in our backyard in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is the largest garment production city in the US, and it also has the highest number of sweatshops in the country. Over 46,000 people work in the industry in LA, and I think it's so important to remind ourselves that when we see that label on our tag in our shirt or on our pants that says made in the USA, it does not automatically equal ethically made. I think often brands tout themselves as made in USA, and we tend to think that means that workers were treated respectfully and paid fairly for their work, when that is unfortunately not the case. It's a super complex issue, again, so I would really recommend following and learning more from the Garment Worker Center if you're interested. Right now, they're behind the Garment Worker Protection Act, SB 62, which is currently moving its way through the legislature. It's really important, and these are some of the key aspects that the bill is bringing forward. One, it's going to expand liability, so ensuring that retailers cannot use layers of contracting to avoid liability. That means brands can be held accountable. Number two, it will prohibit the use of paying garment workers by the piece, thereby eliminating a significant obstacle to workers being paid minimum wage and also protecting their health and safety. That one is huge. And three, it will explicitly authorize the Labor Commissioner's Bureau of Field Enforcement to investigate and cite guarantors for wage theft. If you want to do more to help support the bill, you can head to garmentworkeract.org and you can sign the petition there, and there's other ways to get involved. The inequities of the fashion industry can be felt on both a local and a global level, and the ways we can get involved are multi-level as well. It's not just about buying less and examining our buying habits, it's also about becoming more engaged citizens and realizing that what we say can make an impact from our small and intimate communities and beyond. So, I want to kind of wrap things up with something that I always do on my show as well, where I ask my guests how we can make small changes in our lives to impact a better future for fashion. I want to leave you with a few small ideas, but I think when they're, done in conjunction with others, it can really make a ripple effect. Here's a few ideas to start with. Use what you already have. Be resourceful and try not to think of our clothes as throwaway. They're not disposable. Use your voice in your networks, in your communities, with your local reps. Whenever you can, do your best to speak up. When you want something new, try swapping styles with friends. Swap parties can be super fun, when we're at a time where they'll be safer down the line. Also, shopping secondhand is a great option. Love the garments you have. Mend them, care for them, so you can maybe hand them down to future generations. I try to think really intentionally about how I can take care of my garments, my pieces, because I want to be able to hand them down to my daughter one day. She's only 1 at the moment. Get creative with your closet. This is huge for me. Have fun with what you own and embrace the constraints that sometimes feel like they come with thinking more consciously. Because honestly, creativity flows when we have some constraints. Thank you all so much for tuning in and learning a bit more about the complexities of the fashion industry with me. I'm here if you're ever curious to connect, if you have other questions, or if you want to share your own ideas with me, I'm here for you. I know I dropped a lot on you, but fashion is complicated. It's not as frivolous as so many people may assume that it is. But I hope that you feel like you're not too bombarded with information and you're in a place where you can start thinking about little steps you can take, because we're all on our own journey and we can only start where we are now and make little adjustments that will work for our lifestyles. If you do want to reach out and connect, you can find me on Instagram at Conscious Chatter, on my website, www.consciouschatter.com, or send me an email, kestrel@consciouschatter.com. Thank you so much for having me, Cupertino. I am honored to be a part of your Earth Day festivities. I hope one day we're able to meet in person, and I'm wishing you all a beautiful day. Thanks so much.